Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Liberty Action Network TV. I'm your host, Doreen Finkel, and tonight we're going to be talking about jobs, the economy, the market, and also Obamacare. And with me tonight is Professor Fernando Uribe of Hudson County TV. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doreen. Thanks to Liberty Action Network.
I'd like to go back to 2008, excuse me for a moment, when the market tanked. And I want to ask you, has President Obama been doing enough since 2008 to help the economy grow?
Well, a couple of things. First off, when we look at President Obama's economic record since 2008, taking office, we looked at an unemployment rate that was somewhere above 5%. As we all know, by the beginning of a second term, it's gone up to almost 7.5%. We've seen gas prices triple since then. We've seen an absence of jobs nationally. There's been a lack of job creation by this administration, and it's very discouraging for Americans of all ages, specifically 18 to 35 young Americans who are getting out of college, entering the workforce, and are being demoralized because of these economic conditions. And again, when we look at what this president started doing upon taking office, having both chambers of the Congress working with him, because again, they were controlled by the Democrat Party. We saw 2 stimulus packages being passed and Obamacare, the single biggest tax increase in American history. And what has it done? It's added to the debt. It is just presented an abundant amount of new fees that Americans now have to sort through to find out what's going on with their health care. And ultimately, where are the jobs? Where is that job creation that was promised? That, all that hope and change that he hopefully was going to try to bring in 2009, well, obviously that has not happened. And the facts prove that. Right.
So, in other words, his first term, he was spent basically on passing the stimulus and Obamacare and whatever, and it wasn't focused on creating jobs. Do you think in this term, do you think he's going to focus on that?
Well, one of the things I've always come across, especially talking to Obama supporters during the election last November, was, well, it's going to take 8 years to get out of the previous 8 years. My problem with that rationale is that if we're going to go by that, then by the summer of 2016, when his second term is due to close, we should see unemployment going back down to 5% or less. And we're not going to be seeing that. I mean, it went up to 7.5%, almost 8% in his first term. We've seen spending go up exponentially. We've seen a lack of job creation. Now, again, one of the things that most voters aren't aware of is that the federal government itself doesn't create jobs. When it does, obviously all it does is add to the budget that's already in Washington and also spending. We're talking about deregulating the private sector, which motivates companies and corporations to create jobs for various companies across the country. And that's not happening right now.
You mentioned the unemployment rate around 7 and 8%. Okay, that's what the government is putting out. The real unemployment rate, okay, meaning which one is it, the U6 or the U5, which takes all those into account who have gone through their benefits and either have stopped looking because they can't find a job or they're just doing something else. The real unemployment rate is probably where, about 16% or?
It's definitely in the double digits. I would say it's probably a little over 10%. I mean, I haven't looked at the most recent Congressional Budget Office numbers. But again, as you mentioned before, there are people that were collecting unemployment benefits. Those have run out. Once you stop collecting unemployment benefits, you don't count anymore against that log. So that's what people don't realize, that the number is considerably higher. And what we've seen is this sort of rhetoric from the White House and mostly his colleagues in the Democrat Party, both in the House and in the Senate, that job creation is on its way. Well, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen anything that will remotely even tell us that there's going to be some sort of relief in this economic climate that we're living in. I mean, mind you, Doreen, the Senate has not passed a budget in over 1,000 days. 1,000 days. The Democrat-controlled Senate has not passed a budget. And what we've been seeing for the first 4 years of Obama's term, well, at least for the first 2 years, we saw, again, both chambers of Congress working with the president to pass not one but 2 stimulus packages that did not create the jobs that was promised. It added to the debt, and it brought us the single biggest tax increase in American history, which was the Affordable Health Care Act. otherwise known as Obamacare. And again, after 2010, when the Republicans took control of the House, what we've been seeing is this sort of infighting between the president and different members of Congress. And that's not really helping the dialogue either. I mean, there has to be a real bipartisan effort here by both parties and the president to really attack spending, which is a tremendous problem in Washington. Okay, I mean, for what we're taking in tax revenue-wise and what we're spending, it's just apples and oranges. It's just not adding up.
And the current debt is at 16.7.
Trillion, correct.
Yes, 16.7 trillion. And this debt we're going to pass along to our children.
Well, it's demoralizing when we see what not just people like myself in my age group in their 30s, but my children in the future, what they're inheriting. And not just only that, the debt itself, but the form of government and the bureaucracy that they're also inheriting, as mentioned before with Obamacare. We're talking about also an infringement upon the Second Amendment, as we're seeing now in the national dialogue, where the Justice Department and Attorney General Holder are making it a big priority in the second term to really go after law-abiding citizens who purchase firearms legally, who abide by all regulations, and still they're the ones being scrutinized here, and even to some extent being demagogued by this fringe movement in the country that every gun owner is irresponsible. And we know that's not true.
Right, and let's go back to that for a minute. Okay, we put these people in office, okay, and we had asked that they create jobs and help the economy, but yet they went right along with an agenda.
Well, what I can say is, and to quote Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, that the Congress right now, both chambers of Congress, seem to be about 10 years behind the American public in terms of how the bureaucracy should work, how to address spending, and at the same time, how to address the tax code. That's something that government, and again, both parties have been guilty of this. I don't want to sort of just single out one party. Clearly, the president has had his agenda. He's been able to push it through. And all I can say is that because of a high amount of low information voters is why he was reelected last November. I mean, based on the numbers we saw with the economy, with unemployment, with spending going up, with Obamacare, with all the new regulations, how anyone could look me straight in the face and tell me that they could justify voting for another 4 years of this irresponsible economic philosophy is beyond me. But it happened. You know, I have to respect the wishes of the electorate, but clearly this is a case where the electorate did not do its due diligence with knowing what's going on.
And let's go back to that for a minute. And I want to ask you a question, and I talk about this often. Some people say that Hurricane Sandy played into that election a little bit, swaying the vote more towards Obama.
Well, again, living in New Jersey, we saw the relationship that Governor Christie articulated with the president upon arriving. And listen, Governor Christie was in one of those you're damned if you do, damned if you don't positions. If you didn't welcome the president and agree to work with him to address the damage and look at what funding needed to be assessed to help not just the Jersey Shore, but areas where I live in Hudson County, you know, he would have been seen as, well, he's not working with the administration in Washington, he's not leading. And guess what? And if he did do that, he's going to get smeared by many on the right in this country, and even some within his own party. So he couldn't win that. But in terms of what Hurricane Sandy did, it certainly did a disservice to Governor Romney in the sense of that took up the news cycle the weekend essentially before Election Day. And where Governor Romney, again, was not getting his message out was because, again, the country was so consumed with what was going on with Sandy and what was, you know, all the areas being affected along the East Coast, especially here in New York and New Jersey. That really did a disservice. But at the same time, at the end of the day, whether Sandy happened or not, you still had this high percentage of low information voters that were going out there, that were campaigning for Obama, that if you sat them in a corner and asked them, what is it exactly about President Obama's agenda that's going to benefit you? Because the last 4 years haven't shown it economically. And from people that I talked to, whether it's students of mine, whether it was colleagues in academia, or anyone else, or even fellow journalists, they couldn't give me something other than, well, we don't like what Mitt Romney is offering. Well, that's not enough. You can't go with the devil that you do know as opposed to the devil you don't know. You need to give me substance and not hype. And that's, I think, what a large portion of the electorate fell for last November.
And you mentioned the low information voters. I also happen to think that what the left does is it plays on the touchy-feely. Like, for example, they immobilize Did you ever notice that? The left, or the Democrats particularly, know how to mobilize their people for an election and get the vote out, whereas...
Well, the machine is very good at getting message out. I give a lot of credit to David Axelrod and his team because they went about in a very smart, calculating, methodical type of methodology. But at the same time, I think also that Governor Romney did not do enough to really dispel a lot of the myths that existed out there. That infamous tape about the 47%. I mean, listen, here are some facts that people don't want to accept. Almost 25% of this country doesn't pay a federal income tax. There is a larger portion of people on public assistance now, upon President Obama's first term, than there were 4 years ago. There is more spending going on in Washington. There's more of a debt being accrued. Okay, and when we hear these little catchphrases, the war on women, you know what's a real war on women? Over 250,000 women this past 4 years lost jobs under President Obama. And while I understand that the Democrat Party and the Obama machine carefully crafted this campaign idea that, well, the Republicans and the right are looking to infringe upon, for lack of a better word, a woman's uterus, or looking to infringe upon a woman's reproductive rights. Well, you know what? I bet you if you asked 5 out of every 10 women, they were more concerned about this economy and where they were going to get jobs from, how they could, pay for their meals, how they could pay the rent, how they could pay their mortgage. Those are things that got lost in the campaign cycle last year. And I'm hoping that moving forward next year for the congressional elections, the midterms, that Senate Republicans and House Republicans can really hammer that home again. Because the economy hasn't improved. No matter what anyone sells, it hasn't improved.
Right, and some of us see it as getting worse.
Absolutely.
Before it gets better. But let's go back to a couple things that you mentioned. Let's go to Obamacare. Okay. Why don't the Republicans defund it?
Well, a couple of things. Number one of the biggest misconceptions about the Affordable Health Care Act is that it's going to be easier to get affordable health care, and that's not going to be happening. What we're also seeing with Obamacare is this sort of model where government's going to be even more intrusive into your healthcare providers and at the same time what healthcare you receive. And it always astounds me when I hear members of the left or even members of the Democrat Party, because not all of them do this, but a large portion do, where they talk about, well, government knows best. And it's sort of this reinforcement of the nanny state, where government knows what's best for you. So this is why we have to pass this legislation. This is why we have to pass this sort of law to protect you from yourself. And
it's a mentality.
It's a mentality that's so pervasive. And again, the president is guilty of it as well, but so are his colleagues. Everyone from Senator Reid to Congressman, again, down the line in Washington. It's this sort of nanny state mentality that, again, is just infringing upon people's liberty, their personal privacy, and even more importantly, when we talk about health care. Now, listen, when we talk about socialized medicine, it's very good on paper, as I always like to tell my students and colleagues that, socialism and communism looks great on paper. But when you have to apply it to the real world, it's not as peachy as it's colored out to be. And the reality is, when we talk about socialized medicine, for example, we talk about countries in Europe, whether it be France or England or even up north in Canada. We're talking about with predominantly significantly lesser populations in terms of people. It's a lot easier to manage healthcare for a population of 30 million people as opposed to our country, which right now, according to the census, is quickly approaching 400 million people. Okay, so the bureaucracy is not going to be as bad or inconvenient as it is up north, for example, or across the Atlantic in Europe. That's what people don't get, though. It sounds great on paper, but when you have to start, again, factoring in the bureaucracy and now the new regulations and the new taxes, people aren't informed. And the fact that Obamacare was passed without a large portion of the Congress, predominantly his colleagues in the Democrat Party, not even reading the bill. Okay.
Right, not even
reading the bill. Now, again, if you're suffering from insomnia and you ever want to, cure that, certainly print out the 1,000+ pages of the PDF file and read it. It'll cure insomnia right away.
And we still don't know what's in the bill.
Exactly.
And so we still don't know what's coming down the pipe.
Sure.
And which I want to ask you, what is going to happen to the private insurance companies?
Well, again, I don't work in that industry, but what I can tell you from speaking with individuals that work in that sector, we're going to see these companies being phased out. Now, I understand that there's a certain portion of the healthcare industry that is for profit. like everything else in the private sector, where, again, the administration of healthcare also becomes very clogged up in bureaucracy, in paperwork, and in delays. But when we're talking about a complete government takeover of healthcare, okay, I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I volunteered for my local veterans hospital over in East Orange. And it was a delight to work with these veterans and volunteer and, spend time with them. And there were some that certainly were more incapacitated than others, but, and I did my due diligence of working with them and spending time. For lack of a better word, that's government-funded healthcare, what our veterans receive. And not to offend anyone, but it is not up to par. And if we're doing that to our veterans, if we can't even get it right with treating such a precious population that we have in terms of our brave men and women that come back and have served and now are under care, whether it be medical care, psychiatric care, whatever. If we can't even do right by our veterans, what makes you think we can do right by our population? And that's always been my skepticism about government health care. If we can't if we can't run Social Security adequately, if we can't run medical care for our veterans, what makes anyone think that we can run health care for the general population competently when two other very big government programs, and again, I'm not saying that they're unnecessary, they're very vital, but they haven't been run correctly. And what makes us think that now the government can run health care? It's absurd.
Right. It's like the U.S. postal system. They're in a huge amount of debt there, and that's run by the government.
Sure.
So and you have a lot of excess with government waste and whatnot. But let's also continue with the health care. I want to ask you about jobs in the health care. Will people go on to become a doctor knowing that who knows their pay might not be quite as good as if it was the private industry?
Well, some studies that I've looked at have told me that there are a lot less medical students going now to school. A lot more doctors are very nervous about what Obamacare is going to bring. And with less doctors being available now in the market here in the U.S., it's going to be a problem. And you don't want that. You don't want to take away an incentive for a rewarding career in medicine because of bureaucracy. And that's what seems to be happening. I know some medical students that I talked to over in Manhattan at NYU Medical who are absolutely scared, not just because of the debt that they're inheriting because of going to medical school, but now the jobs are going to be afforded to them in the healthcare industry or even in hospitals. It's not. Again, when we see government stick its hand in something, we've seen a consistent track record of an overindulgence of bureaucracy and to some extent incompetence. And we're seeing that with the way Social Security has been run, with the way, again, veteran care has been run, and now we're seeing it with healthcare slowly but surely. And I don't want to go into the hysteria about whether or not they're going to be death panels. I don't want to go that far. But what I will say is that it's strangling Americans in terms of what these new laws and regulations are going to do. And I don't understand why people don't see that. Take the time to read the bill. I mean, yes, our congressmen and women and our senators did not have the due diligence to do that. But you yourself, as a taxpayer, owe it to yourself to read up on this, to call your local congressman or senator, hold them accountable, take them to task as to why did you vote for this piece of legislation that is doing such a disservice to us as Americans. That's what people need to realize.
So if there's less people going into becoming a doctor, now you have the rationing part because we won't be able to find a doctor.
Correct, yes. I mean, we're going to be seeing that as well, and that's
or a waiting list, maybe.
And that's a big concern. I mean, again, it's not Cuba or Canada.
Just saying, suppose you need open heart surgery, you're placed on a waiting list for 30 days.
I mean, and some people can't afford that, not even financially, but even physically. And again, these are some of the problems we're going to run into. And what we saw again last November, leading up to the campaign, was that President Obama was trying to portray this picture of, well, Obamacare is nothing more than a modification of what Romney Care used to be. Now, listen, I can understand on a state level how that can be beneficial. And I don't want to be disingenuous here and say, well, that I'm completely against that. But you have to understand that on a state level, a program like that can possibly work. But again, it has to be monitored correctly. The excess in fees and administrative costs have to be also minimized. But we're talking about as a country, it's absolutely lethal in terms of the debt that it's incurring. And again, I'll say it again, it's these new regulations, these new fees that people are not aware of. And that's really strangling people.
Who's going to have to pay for them is us,
exactly.
Eventually.
It's the taxpayers, and we're seeing that.
And also, I want to bring up the fact that we will all have to have medical insurance Okay, so suppose then, for example, you are on unemployment and you can't afford it. Then, and I understand this is going to be regulated by the IRS.
I mean, as if the IRS isn't already
You
intrusive enough in our lives.
Right.
Sure. Well, this is the problem, that we've seen the Internal Revenue Service hire almost 50,000 new employees because of Obamacare. And as you mentioned before, that it's going to be required by law starting in January 2014 that if you don't have health insurance, you have to purchase it. And I understand that.
Or you're going to be penalized.
Penalized, and severely. We're not talking about a couple $100s. We're talking about thousands of dollars. And if you're not working and you can't afford health care anyway, that fee is just going to further thrust you into the abyss of financial abyss, and you don't want that.
If you were president, what would you have done? And you were elected in 2008. You have the economy.
Well, what I would do, first of all, again, and this is, I'm not an economist, but it doesn't take an economist to just figure out some very simple things. Cut the capital gains tax.
Okay.
You know, more people that have disposable income are going to want to invest it. Okay? If you start penalizing them for it, they're not going to want to do that. All right? That's the first thing. Secondly, and this is something that may not be popular with some people, but auditing the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is an institution in Washington that's very autonomous. Doesn't answer to anyone, that has a large amount of influence over this country's economic climate. Okay, I know Congressman Ron Paul from Texas had mentioned that, and he was an advocate for it. And a lot of people looked at him as he was insane or he was out of touch, but he was a guy that really had the pulse of his constituency and a lot of people in this country. And the third thing is, as I mentioned before, government doesn't create jobs. Government passes laws that either will reduce regulations or reduce the stranglehold on corporations and companies, which in essence, the private sector is what creates jobs. The private sector is what stimulates an economy. And if we don't see that, that's not a healthy economic philosophy. For whatever reason, the president feels that the wealthy in this country don't pay their fair share. And the reality is this, and this is something I've always conveyed to my students, and this is something that most people don't know. When you look at the tax revenue in this country, Doreen, think of a bowl. Okay, you think of an empty bowl. Of that bowl, roughly 72 to 74% of that bowl, of tax revenue in that bowl itself, is paid by the top 5% of income earners in this country. Okay? Now, if you're making $3 million a year and you're being taxed the regulation 35% of federal income tax, and someone's making $30,000 a year, the person making $30,000 a year certainly is going to feel more of a crunch than the person making $3 million. The problem is not this idea about that the wealthy don't pay their fair share. It's about revising the tax code. Until we revise the tax code to where it's not burdening the middle class and the lower class in this country, we're not going to see economic relief. Demonizing success and trying to demagogue people who are wealthy and successful and have worked hard for it. Maybe some haven't, but a large portion have.
Right.
Penalizing them and smearing them is not the answer. And that's what astounds me when I hear this rhetoric about, well, people have to pay their fair share. The wealthy in this country, the top 5%, pay nearly 3/4 of the tax revenue going to the IRS anyway. Okay? So it's not about how much we're taking in, it's about what we're doing with that money once we're taking it in. And that's incumbent upon Congress to spend it responsibly, and they haven't been doing that.
Right, and you had mentioned the Federal Reserve. I have had a couple of students come to me and say, well, how come the Federal Reserve isn't regulated? Okay, and they think that there should be some kind of checks and balances with it. And so I say to them, well, because it's really, some of them don't understand that the Federal Reserve is not a part of the government.
Correct, yes.
Even though it has the word federal in there. So what would you say to, if somebody asked you that?
Well, it's a completely autonomous part of Washington, not the government itself, but it's an autonomous organization that has a lot of influence over, again, the economy, printing money. See, we can't keep printing money at the rate that we're printing money because it's losing value. Okay, at some point years ago, we looked at the dollar and we looked across the Atlantic and looked at the euro and said, wow, we're really, really falling behind. As we all know now, the economic climate in Europe is absolutely disastrous in many parts, and the euro has also gone down to where it's almost on par with the dollar again. But we can't keep printing money. We have to hold the Federal Reserve. Again, it's an organization that is autonomous, that doesn't have any accountability, doesn't answer to the White House or the Congress. And I still can't explain it. why even the suggestion of auditing the Federal Reserve or calling the chairman of the Federal Reserve to testify in Washington as to what can be done to modify this economic situation that we have right now. Because again, at the rate that we're going, Doreen, unemployment's going to go up. There isn't that job creation that we're expecting. Okay, and more people being reliant on government. We saw a record amount of people registering for disability benefits, for unemployment benefits, for food stamps. Now again, I don't want to demonize anyone that does that. There are people in this country that certainly do need it. Okay?
Absolutely.
And I don't want to demonize any of those. Are there some within our population that use it as just as a lifeline? Absolutely as well. But again, it's about conveying a healthy economic message, and this president hasn't done that. And you know, we can have economists go on TV, whether it's Paul Krugman, who doesn't know what he's talking about more often than not, and others that are completely in cahoots with the White House and members of the Democrat Party, but the facts aren't there. The facts aren't there where unemployment is continuing to rise. It's not even stagnant. If you're telling me that, it's remaining stagnant, it hasn't. And the numbers aren't even accurate either, which is doing even more of a disservice to the dialogue, because we're not even dealing with an accurate unemployment number.
Right, because the government doesn't want us to know.
No, of course not, no.
And also I want to ask you, you mentioned the euro and also the dollar. Could there be some point where we become like Greece?
Well, I would hope not. There are some in this country that are fearing that. Again, just to reference Senator Paul from Kentucky, who has warned about what's going on across the Atlantic, about seeing the lack of economic mismanagement that's been going on in countries such as Greece. We're seeing it in Spain to some extent as well. And again, it's sooner or later, the economic chickens are going to come home to roost in this country. We've been seeing both parties in Washington taking in a lot more money. Spending a lot more money than they're taking in. And we keep hearing these words such as the fiscal cliff, sequester, and using these scare tactics about, if we don't come to some sort of fiscal compromise, or at least sit down objectively. See, what's very disconcerting to me is I see so many of our congressmen and women and senators not being in session more often than not. Okay? For those viewers today that witnessed Senator Paul's filibuster of over 12 hours weeks ago, that was inspiring to me, because it was really standing up in front of the country and really calling out his colleagues for lack of a better word, for not doing their job. And that's what's happening. It was a good point you mentioned before about that we elect people to go to Washington, and they're not representing us. They're not representing a healthy economic message. And again, it's both parties. Now, can we say one party's guiltier than the other? Sure. But it's beyond blame now. We can sit here and start pointing fingers, but at this point in time where we see that the economic climate in this country is rapidly approaching a critical stage, it goes beyond blame now. It's about rolling up your sleeves, sitting at a table, and coming up with solutions. And we don't put enough onus or pressure on our elected leaders to do that.
Okay. I'd like to thank Professor Fernando Uribe for coming on our show tonight. And stay tuned till next week when the Liberty Action Network goes with a show called The Communist Manifesto, starring Dr. Joseph Armenio. Till then, thank you very much for watching us.